My name is Eleanor Sterling. I am 28 years old, and my father ordered me out of my own house when my son was barely 6 weeks old. He stood in my living room, checked his gold watch, and told me to make room for my older sister's family. He said they needed the space for their growing social obligations, and that a single mother like me belonged in a rented apartment downtown. He assumed I would cry, pack my bags, and walk away from the historic stone colonial I had purchased with my own money. What none of them understood was that my name, and my name alone, sat on the county deed. Welcome back to Orange Vengeance, where we tell stories about ordinary people facing impossible choices and the quiet courage it takes to turn the tables. If you have ever watched your own family try to take what you built, drop your age and your city in the comments. I read every single one. To understand how my father felt entitled to evict a nursing mother, you have to understand the Pennsylvania Main Line. In this stretch of affluent suburbs, a property is not just a place to sleep. It is a ledger of a family's worth. I bought this slate-roofed colonial at a distressed sale using relentless savings from my career as a data scientist. But my father, Richard, had spent the last 2 years bragging at his country club that he had purchased the estate for his single daughter as an act of generosity. I had never bothered to correct the rumor because I preferred my privacy. My silence convinced him that his own lie was reality. The rain was drumming against the leaded glass windows on the Tuesday morning he marched through my front door. He did not knock. He did not ask how my baby Leo had slept. He stepped onto my Persian rug with wet leather shoes, smoothed his silk tie, and delivered a directive the way he might dismiss a junior analyst at his commercial real estate firm. "Pack up the nursery, Eleanor," he said. "Caroline and Derek are moving in this weekend. I have already let Caroline know it is settled. She is arranging painters for Monday." I shifted Leo against my shoulder, pulling a soft blanket over his head to shield him from the cold draft. I asked him what he meant. He took 2 steps further into the room, scanning the crown molding rather than looking at his grandson. "A single mother does not need 4 bedrooms, he said, his voice echoing in the foyer. "It makes the most sense. Have your things packed by Friday." He walked out, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind him. The brass latch clicked into place. I did not scream. I did not chase him into the rain to argue. My profession requires me to look at chaotic sets of information and isolate the undeniable truth hiding beneath the noise. Sitting in that chair, feeling the steady rise and fall of my infant's chest, I analyzed my father. I noted the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the autumn chill. I noted his rigid posture, the way his gaze darted away from mine. He was not merely making an arrogant demand. He was executing a desperate maneuver. I knew how to handle desperate men. I put my baby in his crib, opened my laptop, and started pulling the public property records. To comprehend the sheer audacity required for a man to attempt an eviction of his own daughter, you must first understand a lie that had been breathing and growing for 24 months. My entire professional existence is predicated on finding the truth buried beneath suffocating layers of noise. I work as a senior data scientist for a prominent financial technology firm in Philadelphia. My daily reality involves sorting through terabytes of raw transactional numbers, stripping away the static of human error, and isolating statistical anomalies. I build predictive models based on behavioral patterns. In my line of work, people lie constantly. They inflate their income on loan applications, they obscure their debts, they hide assets behind shell corporations, and they weave elaborate financial fictions to project a wealth they do not possess. But the data never lies. It simply waits in the dark for someone to read it correctly. I applied that exact analytical rigor to my personal life, especially when it came to securing my own independence. 2 years ago, long before Leo was even a thought, this house went on the market. It was a distressed estate sale. The property is a sprawling historic stone colonial with a slate roof that needed extensive repair, dated copper plumbing that groaned in the winter, and strict historical society regulations that terrified the usual buyers. Most people saw a money pit. I saw an undervalued asset priced well below the market rate for this zip code. I did the math. I drained my savings accounts, liquidated my vested stock options, and negotiated a brutal closing process entirely on my own. I sat in a leather chair at a title company in downtown Philadelphia and signed the closing documents with my own pen. The deed, the extensive title insurance paperwork, and the 30-year fixed mortgage contain only one signature: mine. I spent the next year overseeing contractors breathing in drywall dust and restoring the hardwood floors until they gleamed. I earned every square inch of this property through sheer discipline. However, on the Pennsylvania Main Line, a single 26-year-old woman acquiring a historic stone estate disrupts the established social hierarchy. My father could not process it. Richard is a man who measures his intrinsic worth by the visible envy of his peers at his golf club. A successful, fiercely independent daughter does not feed his ego. A dependent, grateful daughter provides the narrative he requires to feel powerful. I remember the exact evening the lie was born. It was late summer during a charity dinner hosted on the flagstone terrace of the club. The air smelled of expensive cigars and roasted prime rib. I was standing near the edge of the patio, holding a glass of sparkling water, when I heard my father holding court with a group of older men. He had a glass of bourbon in his hand, his voice carrying over the clinking crystal. "I found a beautiful little starter home for Eleanor," Richard had said, puffing his chest slightly. "It needed work, but I wanted to make sure she was secure in a good neighborhood. I wrote the check myself. It is a father's duty to provide the nest after all." The men around him nodded in solemn agreement, praising his generosity. I was standing less than 10 feet away. I heard every single syllable. I could have walked over and corrected him. I could have pulled up the county tax records on my phone right there on the terrace and shown those men the truth. But I prefer my peace. Engaging with Richard's delusions only invites endless draining debates about respect tone and family hierarchy. I chose to walk away and let him have his audience. I assumed it was a harmless stroke of a fragile aging ego. I assumed the truth of the paperwork would always outweigh the fiction of his cocktail party stories. That silence was a critical miscalculation. In the absence of friction, a lie solidifies into a false reality. Because he claimed ownership of the house in public, without consequence, his brain slowly rewired itself to believe he held actual authority in private. By repeating the story to his friends, his colleagues, and our extended relatives, he convinced himself that the fiction was fact. He genuinely believed that his patriarchal shadow covered the property lines of my estate. The physical consequence of that delusion arrived later that same Tuesday afternoon. The rain was still washing over the slate roof when a delivery van backed slowly up my long gravel driveway. The doorbell chimed, a sharp sound that woke Leo from his nap in the bassinet. I carried my son to the front door and opened it. A delivery driver wearing a damp uniform stood on the porch holding a digital clipboard. He dropped a heavy, thick bundle of flattened cardboard moving boxes onto the stone step. "Prepaid delivery from Richard Sterling," the driver said, holding out a stylus for me to sign the screen. I signed my name with a steady hand, thanked the driver, and watched him pull away. I looked down at the bundle of cardboard. It was a physical manifestation of my father's supreme arrogance. He was sending packing supplies to the legal owner of the property, fully expecting her to box up her life and disappear on his command. I pulled the heavy bundle inside the wet cardboard, leaving a faint, damp trail on the hardwood floor. I dropped the boxes onto the Persian rug in the foyer. They landed with a dull thud. A normal person might have called their father screaming into the phone. A normal person might have thrown the cardboard out into the front yard to disintegrate in the rain. I did not do either of those things. I deal in predictive models. When a variable behaves erratically in a system, you do not yell at the screen. You track the anomaly. You build a dataset to understand the underlying catalyst causing the deviation. You prepare for the next fluctuation. I walked into my home office, a quiet room paneled in dark cherry wood with a view of the dripping oak trees in the backyard. I placed Leo in his rocker beside my desk and woke up my laptop. My fingers moved over the keyboard with practiced precision. I created a new encrypted digital folder on my secure hard drive. I named the file Sterling Eviction. I began pulling the raw data of my life. I downloaded 24 months of bank statements digitally, highlighting every single mortgage payment, every property tax wire transfer, every utility bill, and every contractor invoice I had paid since taking possession of the home. I scanned the original notarized deed. I added the title insurance policy. I built an undeniable ironclad ledger of ownership. My father was a proud man who enjoyed issuing orders, but he was also a man who avoided the friction of physical labor. If he wanted me packed and out of my home by Friday, he would not be the one taping the boxes or measuring the rooms. He would send a proxy. He would send the person who stood to benefit the most from my displacement. I closed the encrypted file, watching the screen fade to black. I looked toward the hallway leading back to the foyer. I knew exactly who would walk through my front door next. The cardboard boxes sat waiting on the rug, a silent promise of the invasion that would arrive tomorrow. The next afternoon arrived with clear skies and a biting wind that stripped the remaining brown leaves from the oak trees lining my driveway. I spent the morning working remotely from the kitchen island, compiling predictive algorithms, while Leo slept in his carrier strapped to my chest. By 2 o'clock, the familiar fatigue of early motherhood began to settle behind my eyes. I unbuckled the carrier, carried my son up the curved wooden staircase, and laid him gently in his crib. The nursery is a room I designed with meticulous intent. It features wainscoting painted in a soft sage green and a restored bay window overlooking the rear gardens. I stood by the crib for a long moment, listening to Leo settle into a steady, peaceful breathing rhythm. Downstairs, the heavy brass latch of the mudroom door clicked open. I froze. The mudroom entrance sits at the back of the house, accessible only through the gated driveway. I had given my sister a spare key a year ago during the peak of the property renovations, in case a contractor needed emergency access. I never asked for it back. It was an oversight, an anomaly in my normally secure routine, and now that oversight was walking through my kitchen. Footsteps clicked across the hardwood, moving with brisk, familiar entitlement. They bypassed the living room and headed straight for the stairs. Caroline was ascending. My older sister and her husband Derek represent a very specific archetype within our Pennsylvania suburb. They are the golden couple of the country club set individuals whose entire existence orbits around the maintenance of appearances. They lease imported luxury vehicles they replace every 2 years. They host catered summer parties where the guest list is curated based entirely on net worth and social utility. Caroline measures a person by the designer label stitched into their coat collar, while Derek measures them by their golf handicap. Growing up, Caroline was always handed the keys to the kingdom. My parents viewed her superficial charm and strict adherence to social expectations as the highest form of success. She played the game flawlessly, marrying a man with perfectly styled hair and a lucrative title in corporate finance. I was the outlier who studied statistics, bought my own real estate, and had a baby on my own timeline. The footsteps reached the second-floor landing. I stepped out of the nursery and into the hallway. Caroline stood near the linen closet. She wore a tailored camel coat over a cashmere sweater, a leather designer tote slung over her shoulder. She did not look surprised to see me. In fact, she did not look at me at all. Her gaze swept over the original crown molding and the refinished floors, assessing the architecture the way a real estate appraiser evaluates a foreclosure. She brushed past me without a greeting and stepped right into the nursery. I followed her, keeping my steps light so I would not wake the baby. Caroline stood in the center of the room. She reached into her leather tote and pulled out a bright yellow measuring tape. She pulled the metal tab, stretching the yellow ribbon across the width of the room, laying it right against the wall where my son rested in his crib. The metal tape snapped softly against the baseboard. She tapped a manicured fingernail against the sage green wainscoting. "Derek's new promotion requires us to host partner dinners," Caroline whispered, though her tone lacked any genuine consideration for the sleeping infant nearby. "We simply cannot entertain senior executives in a townhouse. We need formal dining space and proper guest quarters." She let the measuring tape retract with a sharp zip, oblivious to the way Leo stirred at the sudden noise. She stepped backward, her leather boot casually crushing a pile of freshly folded baby laundry I had set on the rug. She did not look down. "A single mom just doesn't need a 4-bedroom stone house, Ellie," Caroline said, turning to face me. Dad said you'd be out by Friday. I've already scheduled the painters for Monday morning. They are going to prime over this green. It is much too dark for a home office. She stood in the center of my child's room, redesigning my home to fit her husband's corporate ambitions. She spoke with a serene, untouchable entitlement. She was gaslighting me on my own property, treating me not as a homeowner, but as a squatter who had overstayed a temporary welcome. You scheduled painters, I said softly, ensuring my voice remained a flat, emotionless line. Caroline sighed, shifting the designer bag on her shoulder. She offered a smile that contained pity rather than warmth. Don't make this difficult, she said. We are actually trying to be accommodating. Derek and I discussed it on the drive over. We are going to allow you to take the washer and dryer to your new apartment. Most landlords charge a premium for in-unit laundry, so we consider that a generous compromise. You can pack the kitchen appliances too, but leave the refrigerator. It matches the cabinetry here. I leaned against the door frame, folding my arms across my chest. A typical reaction would involve shouting. A standard reaction would involve snatching the yellow measuring tape from her hand and demanding she leave the premises. But anger is an inefficient response. Anger clouds judgment and reveals your hand to the opponent. I applied the fundamental rules of data science to the situation playing out in front of me. I removed the emotional static of her insults and observed the raw data of her physical behavior. Caroline was speaking quickly, her words clipping together. The knuckles gripping her leather tote were bone white. Her breathing was shallow. She was dressed impeccably, but her camel coat was missing a button near the hem, a detail she would normally never overlook. She had driven here on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of the work week to measure a room for a home office. This was not a woman preparing for a triumphant social upgrade. This was a woman operating under severe immediate distress. Her behavior contradicted her narrative. If Derek had truly received a lucrative promotion, they would be touring properties in the exclusive gated communities further down the main line. They would be hiring architects to build custom estates. They would not be engaging in a hostile takeover of a sibling's house under the guise of patriarchal authority. Furthermore, people who secure lucrative promotions do not bargain over used washing machines. You want me out by Friday? I stated, keeping my eyes fixed on her face. That is the timeline Dad established, Caroline replied, her gaze darting toward the window. You need to be realistic. You cannot afford the upkeep on a property this size. The landscaping alone must be draining your accounts. We are stepping in to assume the burden so you can focus on the baby. She framed the theft of my equity as an act of familial charity. It was a fascinating psychological tactic, one my parents had utilized for decades to justify their overreach. I pushed off the doorframe and took a single step toward her. I did not raise my voice, but I lowered the register, projecting a calm certainty that I knew she lacked. Leave the key on the dresser, I said. Caroline blinked, her practiced smile faltering for a fraction of a second. What? The spare key you used to enter the mudroom, I clarified. Place it on the dresser, then turn around and walk out the same way you came in. Her posture stiffened. The veneer of the supportive older sister vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. You are being ridiculous, she hissed, her voice rising slightly. This is not a negotiation. The decision has been made. You are packing your things. Place the key on the dresser, Caroline. We stood in the quiet nursery, the tension pulling tight between us. She searched my face for any sign of capitulation, any trace of the obedient younger sister she remembered from our childhood. She found nothing. My expression remained entirely neutral. She reached into her coat pocket, retrieved the silver brass key, and dropped it onto the wooden dresser. It landed with a sharp clatter. Dad warned me you would be stubborn, Caroline said, turning toward the hallway. He is coming back tomorrow. You are only making this harder on yourself. She walked out of the nursery, her boots striking the hardwood with heavy, frustrated thuds. I listened as she descended the stairs, crossed the kitchen, and opened the mudroom door. The heavy latch clicked shut. A moment later, the engine of her luxury SUV started in the driveway, the tires crunching over the gravel as she sped away. I walked over to the dresser and picked up the spare key. The metal was still warm from her pocket. I slipped it into my own pocket and looked back at my son, who was still sleeping peacefully in his crib. Caroline's visit confirmed my initial hypothesis. My father's demand yesterday was not an isolated incident of arrogance. It was part of a coordinated, desperate invasion. Caroline and Derek needed this house. They needed it fast enough to schedule painters before I had even packed a single box. They were attempting a forced occupation, relying on shock and familial pressure to drive me out before I could question the logistics of their demand. But why the sudden urgency? Why the frantic rush to claim a property they knew I legally owned? People only act with this level of reckless desperation when they are running out of time. There was a hidden variable in their equation, a catastrophic failure they were trying to outrun. I walked downstairs to my home office and woke up my laptop. I needed to look past their polished social media profiles and their country club smiles. I needed to dig into the cold, hard numbers. I needed to find out exactly what Derek and my father were hiding. People who possess genuine wealth do not steal from nursing mothers. It is a fundamental rule of resource allocation. Secure individuals expand their territories. Insolvent individuals raid the resources of their weaker neighbors. My sister had marched into my nursery measuring the walls for a formal dining room, claiming her husband needed space to entertain senior partners. But the arithmetic of her panic contradicted her narrative of upward mobility. I waited until the house settled into silence. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight. Leo was swaddled and breathing evenly in his bassinet, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence. I poured a cup of black coffee, carried my laptop to the kitchen island, and opened a secure browser. I did not care about country club whispers or the curated fiction my family posted online. Gossip is a distortion. Public records are absolute. In Pennsylvania, the illusion of prestige is often guarded by a fortress of non-disclosure agreements and private settlements. However, the county court registries and state property tax databases offer a transparent window into any citizen's actual financial health. I bypassed the standard search engines. I accessed the state civil docket portal. I entered Derek's full legal name. The system processed the query for 3 seconds before populating a list of recent filings. The fourth result was a civil complaint filed 4 months prior by Derek's former employer, a prominent boutique investment bank. I paid the minor fee to download the unredacted digital document. Reading through the legal jargon, the pristine image of my brother-in-law shattered into jagged statistical fragments. Derek had not received a lucrative promotion. He had been quietly terminated for cause. The complaint detailed a systematic diversion of corporate funds, a theft disguised as consulting fees for a phantom startup venture he had created. The bank had agreed to keep the termination quiet, in exchange for strict restitution, a standard maneuver to protect their own institutional reputation. My sister had stood in my home wearing cashmere and carrying a designer tote, pretending her husband was ascending the corporate ladder when he was actually a disgraced, unemployed liability dodging a criminal indictment. Their entire current existence was a theater production funded by debt. The luxury cars in their driveway were leased. The tailored suits were armor designed to deflect suspicion. Caroline's frantic need to acquire my property was not born of social ambition. It was born of sheer terror. They could not afford their current mortgage, let alone upgrade to a larger estate to host fictitious partners. But Derek's ruin did not explain my father's involvement. Richard Sterling was a man who prided himself on risk mitigation. He spent decades lecturing me on the importance of conservative leverage and asset protection. Why would a seasoned commercial real estate developer risk his own pristine reputation to act as a physical enforcer for his unemployed son-in-law? I opened a new tab and pulled the commercial lending registries for my father's firm. The search results were a graveyard of bad paper. For the past decade, Richard's firm had not developed a single new property. He had been shuffling debt using the equity from his older buildings to finance the maintenance of his failing portfolio. The facade of his thriving business was nothing more than a precarious house of cards held together by high-interest mezzanine loans. The fatal link between the two men emerged when I searched the State Uniform Commercial Code filings. 8 months ago, right before Derek's fraudulent startup collapsed, Richard had acted as the primary guarantor for a predatory short-term commercial loan to fund Derek's venture. The principal was staggering. My father, blinded by his desperate need to maintain his golden daughter's lifestyle, had leveraged his own liquidity to back a sinking ship. He had co-signed a toxic debt instrument that carried a punitive default rate. When Derek was fired and the startup dissolved, the debt landed squarely on Richard's shoulders. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The chain of liability did not stop at my father's commercial properties. I queried the residential property tax records for my parents' address. Their home is a sprawling Tudor estate that has been in my mother's family for 3 generations. It is the epicenter of their social identity, the physical manifestation of their mainline legacy. The county clerk's database returned a chilling document dated just 2 weeks ago. A formal notice of default had been filed against the Tudor estate. Richard had cross-collateralized his personal residence to secure Derek's loan. The bank was initiating foreclosure proceedings. The entire puzzle clicked into place, forming a horrifying picture of generational betrayal. They were not attempting to evict me because Caroline needed space to host dinner parties. They were entirely insolvent. They were staring down the barrel of imminent public bankruptcy and the loss of their ancestral home. Then they looked at me. They saw a 28-year-old single mother recovering from childbirth. They saw a quiet, introverted daughter who had never challenged their authority. More importantly, they saw an unencumbered asset. My historic stone colonial was paid off. It held hundreds of thousands of dollars in pure, accessible equity. Their strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. They intended to terrorize me into abandoning the property. Once I vacated, Richard would use the fiction he had planted among his peers, the lie that he was the true owner, to justify moving his golden daughter into the house. They would likely attempt to forge a quitclaim deed or coerce me into signing over the title under extreme duress. Once they controlled the asset, they could pull a cash-out refinance to satisfy the predatory loan and save their Tudor estate from the auction block. The notice of default laid out the timeline with brutal clarity. The lender had granted a 30-day cure period before scheduling the sheriff's sale. That explained the frantic urgency. That explained why Caroline was measuring my nursery on a Wednesday afternoon and scheduling painters for Monday. They needed to seize control of my equity before the bank published the foreclosure notice in the local county ledger. The local ledger is read religiously by every prominent family in our zip code. If that notice went to print, their social standing would evaporate overnight. The country club board would quietly ask them to step down. The charity galas would stop sending invitations. They would become pariahs in the only world they valued. I was not a daughter to them. I was a life raft. They were willing to drown me and my infant son in the freezing waters of financial ruin just to keep their own heads above the surface. The demand to move into a rented apartment downtown was a sentence to poverty designed to strip me of my wealth so they could preserve their country club memberships. The soft blue light of the laptop screen illuminated the dark kitchen, casting long shadows against the custom cabinetry I had installed by hand. The numbers on the screen were stark, undeniable proof of their moral bankruptcy. I closed the laptop, the sudden darkness enveloping the room. I sat in the silence, listening to the wind rattle the old copper gutters outside. The shock of their betrayal began to recede, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. They viewed me as a soft target. They assumed my silence over the years was a symptom of weakness. They were about to learn the difference between submission and observation. The dawn light broke through the overcast Pennsylvania sky, casting long, pale shadows across the original hardwood floors of my living room. I sat in the rocking chair, a quiet rhythm established as I fed my 6-week-old son. The house was wrapped in the stillness of early morning, a stark contrast to the turbulent data I had processed just hours before. The financial ruin of my father and brother-in-law was a verified fact, sitting in an encrypted folder on my hard drive. I knew the truth of their insolvency. I also knew that cornered individuals rarely surrender. They change tactics. My phone vibrated on the marble kitchen island, the low hum pulling my attention away from Leo. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. Catherine Sterling did not make unprompted morning phone calls unless she was directing a social event or attempting to control a narrative. To comprehend my mother, you must view her through the lens of social currency. Catherine was the supreme architect of our family's public image. She had spent decades cultivating a pristine reputation among the country club elite and the local historical society. She measured maternal success not by the emotional well-being of her daughters, but by how well our achievements could be weaponized in her competitive circles. Caroline, with her leased luxury cars and carefully curated aesthetic, was the perfect proxy for Catherine's ambitions. I, on the other hand, chose to analyze datasets, purchase my own property, and live quietly. In Catherine's calculus, my autonomy was not an achievement. It was a failure of compliance. I let the phone vibrate 3 times before I answered. I did not offer a greeting. I simply pressed the device to my ear and waited. The line carried a heavy, calculated sigh. It was the precise wounded exhalation she deployed during charity board meetings when a committee member dared to disagree with her seating arrangements. "You have always been so selfishly independent," Catherine said. Her voice dripped with practiced disappointment. She did not ask how I was recovering from childbirth. She did not inquire if her infant grandson had slept through the night. She bypassed every fundamental element of maternal care and launched directly into emotional extortion. "I am sitting in my own home holding my child," I replied, keeping my tone strictly neutral. "Independence is the reason I have a roof over my head." "Do not use that cold, analytical tone with me." She snapped the polished veneer, slipping for a fraction of a second before she expertly readjusted it. "Caroline is in a very delicate place right now. Her husband is facing immense corporate pressure. They need stability. Family helps family, and this house is part of the Sterling legacy. Be a good sister and step aside." Step. The words hung in the quiet air of my kitchen. I processed the structure of her argument. She was deploying the concept of a family legacy as a blunt instrument. In the wealthy enclaves of the main line, the concept of ancestral legacy is a powerful tool used to enforce obedience. But I had read the court dockets. I had seen the notice of default filed against her own historic Tudor estate. The realization washed over me with chilling clarity. Catherine knew everything. She was not an innocent bystander being manipulated by my father's lies. She was a fully aware, active participant in the cover-up. She knew Derek had been terminated for embezzlement. She knew Richard had co-signed a toxic loan that was currently dragging their own property into foreclosure. She knew the bank was preparing to publish their financial ruin in the county ledger. My mother was staring at the imminent collapse of her entire social identity. To prevent her peers from discovering her insolvency, she was perfectly willing to sacrifice her youngest daughter. She was demanding that I surrender my paid-off equity so they could leverage my property to save their own. She wanted me to pack up my newborn son and disappear into a rented apartment downtown, absorbing the pain of their financial crimes so Caroline could maintain the illusion of a flawless life. It was a breathtaking display of moral bankruptcy. The Sterling legacy currently consists of a defaulted commercial loan and a pending foreclosure on your Tudor estate. I stated, my voice devoid of any inflection. I read the public registry filings last night. I know Derek was fired for cause. I know Dad cross-collateralized your house to back Derek's failed venture. There is no legacy left to protect. Silence stretched across the cellular connection. It was a dense, suffocating silence. I had introduced undeniable facts into a conversation built entirely on emotional manipulation. For a woman who spent her life managing perceptions, raw truth was a foreign language she did not know how to speak. When Catherine finally found her voice, the wounded mother routine vanished. The tone that replaced it was brittle and sharp, devoid of any familial warmth. "You are an ungrateful, callous girl," she said, each word landing like a stone on an icy pond. "We are trying to preserve the standing of this family. If you refuse to do your part, if you force your sister into the street while you hoard a 4-bedroom estate, you will face the consequences." "I am not forcing anyone into the street," I corrected her. "Derek's theft and Dad's predatory loan did that. I am simply refusing to pay their debts with my home. If you do this, Catherine threatened, her voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper, you will be cut off from the family permanently. We will erase you. You will have no support, no inheritance, and no standing in this community. You will have nothing. She delivered the ultimatum, expecting it to serve as the ultimate trump card. In her world, being ostracized from the family dynasty was the equivalent of a death sentence. She believed that the threat of social isolation would terrify a postpartum mother into immediate submission. She fundamentally misunderstood the variables of the equation. I already have everything I need, I said. I ended the call. The screen went black and I set the phone face down on the marble counter. I looked down at Leo. He was watching me with wide, unblinking eyes, his tiny hands curled into fists against his chest. I traced the soft curve of his cheek with my thumb. My mother believed she was punishing me with the threat of excommunication. What she failed to realize was that being cut off from a sinking ship is not a punishment. It is a rescue. They were a vessel taking on water, dragging down anyone tethered to their hull. Severing the ties was the only logical path to survival. I had spent my entire life feeling like a secondary character in their curated family drama. I had allowed them to take credit for my achievements and dictate the terms of our interactions. But looking at the quiet strength of my own home, the walls I had restored, and the child I was protecting, I felt a profound sense of liberation. I was not losing a family. I was shedding a liability. I was already building my own lifeboat, and the passenger manifest was restricted strictly to me and my son. However, analytical logic also dictated that the conflict was far from over. By calling their bluff and exposing my knowledge of their financial ruin, I had effectively removed their ability to manipulate me through guilt or social pressure. When emotional extortion fails, desperate people do not simply retreat and accept defeat. They escalate. They abandon subtle coercion and resort to direct physical confrontation. I walked over to the security panel mounted on the wall near the front door. I checked the battery levels on the exterior cameras and verified the connection to the perimeter alarms. My family was running out of time before the bank finalized the foreclosure on their estate. They needed my house immediately. They would not wait for a polite resolution, and they would not respect the boundaries of daylight. I knew the true test of my resolve would arrive under the cover of darkness. The transition from emotional extortion to physical intimidation occurred exactly 42 hours after my father first ordered me to vacate. People who are out of time do not respect boundaries, and they certainly do not respect the sanctity of a locked door. It was Thursday morning, precisely 2 o'clock. A harsh, freezing rain was falling across the Pennsylvania main line, coating the century-old oak trees and the slate roofs in a thin, brittle layer of ice. The neighborhood was submerged in the deep, undisturbed quiet that characterizes affluent suburbs in the middle of the night. I was awake, sitting in the upholstered rocker in the nursery. Only a small amber nightlight illuminated the room. I held Leo against my chest, swaying gently to soothe him back to sleep. The rhythm of his breathing was just beginning to slow when the silence shattered. My phone vibrated on the side table. It was not a text message or an email notification. It was a sustained rhythmic pulse indicating a perimeter breach. I had programmed the security system to send silent alerts to my device, rather than sounding an immediate audible chime inside the house, ensuring the baby would not be disturbed by false alarms. I kept my left arm wrapped securely around my son. With my right hand, I picked up the phone. The screen cast a pale blue glow across the dark nursery. I tapped the notification authenticating my identity and opened the live feed from the high-definition camera mounted above the front entrance. The infrared sensor displayed a crisp, grayscale image of my front porch. 3 figures stood huddled under the stone archway, shielding themselves from the freezing rain. I recognized the silhouettes instantly. My father stood closest to the door. Even in the dead of night, Richard wore a tailored trench coat, the collar turned up against the wind. Beside him stood my brother-in-law, Derek. Derek shifted his weight from foot to foot, constantly looking over his shoulder toward the dark street. He was a man accustomed to hiding behind the authority of others, and his nervous energy was palpable even through a silent video feed. The third man was a stranger. He wore a heavy reflective utility jacket and a baseball cap pulled low to block the sleet. He carried a thick canvas tool bag over his shoulder. I watched the stranger unzip the canvas bag and pull out a cordless power drill. The scene unfolding on my screen was a masterclass in predatory tactics. My father was pointing a gloved finger directly at the heavy brass deadbolt securing my front door. He was directing the stranger, a 24-hour emergency locksmith, to drill through the locking mechanism. The logic behind their midnight arrival was as transparent as it was chilling. In property disputes, physical possession is a potent weapon. Richard understood that he had no legal right to the home, but he also understood the lethargic nature of civil courts. If he could change the locks while I was inside, he would establish a physical barrier. He would effectively become the gatekeeper of my own property. By controlling the access points, he could dictate who entered and who left. He was attempting an illegal self-help eviction under the cover of darkness, aiming to terrorize a new mother into packing her bags before the sun came up. My pulse spiked. A sudden surge of adrenaline flooded my bloodstream, a biological imperative urging me to protect my child. The primal instinct was to run downstairs, pound my fists against the heavy oak, and scream at them to leave. I forced that instinct down. Shouting through a locked door is a reaction born of panic. It reveals fear, and fear is exactly the currency my father was trying to extract from me. As a data scientist, I am trained to evaluate threats through a systemic lens. I looked at the variables on the screen. The heavy oak door was an original fixture reinforced with steel and fitted with a high-grade deadbolt. It could not be kicked in. The only way through was the drill. The locksmith was leaning forward, pressing the metal bit against the brass lock, preparing to pull the trigger. The locksmith was the vulnerability in their equation. Licensed professionals operate under strict state regulations. This man had likely been hired under the pretense of a routine lockout. My father had undoubtedly presented himself as the rightful homeowner who had simply misplaced his keys. The locksmith believed he was performing a standard service call. He did not know he was being used as an accessory to breaking and entering. I needed to break the illusion of my father's authority. I needed to introduce a variable they could not control. I did not move from the rocking chair. I kept Leo pressed safely against my shoulder. I navigated away from the camera feed and opened the central command application for my smart home system. The interface provided total control over the property's exterior environment. In communities built on generational wealth, discretion is the highest social value. People here guard their privacy fiercely. A disturbance in the middle of the night is not just an annoyance. It is a profound social transgression. Richard was relying on the secrecy of the freezing rain and the darkness to execute his plan without drawing the gaze of the neighbors. I placed my thumb on the digital toggle labeled Exterior Defense. I swiped right. Outside the perimeter of my historic stone colonial erupted. 4 high-intensity LED floodlights mounted under the eaves of the roofline ignited simultaneously. The blinding, clinical white light washed over the flagstone porch, eliminating the shadows and exposing the 3 men in stark relief. A fraction of a second later, the main security siren activated. It was not a subtle sound. It was a piercing, high-decibel shriek designed to penetrate solid brick and shatter the quiet of the entire block. The alarm wailed into the freezing rain, echoing off the neighboring estates. I switched back to the live camera feed to observe the results. The effect was instantaneous. On the screen, the locksmith jumped backward as if he had been struck by a physical force. The sudden flood of light and the deafening siren stripped away the false narrative my father had spun. A legitimate homeowner does not trigger a perimeter alarm while standing on their own front porch. The locksmith realized immediately that he had been dragged into a dispute that carried severe criminal liabilities. He did not ask for clarification. He did not wait for my father to explain. The stranger dropped his drill into the canvas bag, turned on his heel, and sprinted down the gravel driveway toward his parked service van. Derek panicked next. The blaring siren was a beacon drawing the attention they desperately needed to avoid. He abandoned my father on the porch, jogging rapidly into the darkness to escape the blinding glare of the floodlights. Richard was left standing alone. The heavy rain plastered his hair to his forehead. He squinted into the harsh LED beams, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He glared directly at the camera lens mounted above the door. He knew I was watching. He knew his silent invasion had failed. He turned and walked stiffly down the driveway, his pride wounded, his plan ruined. I deactivated the siren, letting the quiet wash back over the neighborhood, but I left the floodlights burning bright. Leo shifted against my chest, letting out a small, sleepy sigh, entirely unaware of the siege that had just been repelled at our front door. 30 seconds later, the screen of my phone lit up with a new text message. It was from Richard. "Stop making this difficult." I read the 4 words twice. There was no apology. There was no shame for attempting to drill through the locks of a house containing his infant grandson. There was only the cold, commanding anger of a man who felt his authority had been unjustly challenged. The text message was a gift. It was documented, time-stamped proof of his malicious intent. The midnight raid fundamentally altered the landscape of our conflict. My family had crossed a critical threshold. They had proven they were willing to bypass legal channels and resort to physical intimidation. They were no longer just issuing demands. They were actively attempting to seize the property by force. I could not simply sit inside and play defense against their incursions. I needed to build a fortress they could not breach, not just with deadbolts and sirens, but with the full crushing weight of the law. I needed to ensure that the next time they set foot on my property, they would be met with consequences they could not manipulate or evade. I settled Leo back into his crib, the amber nightlight casting a soft glow over his sleeping form. I walked into my home office and turned on the desk lamp. The rain continued to beat against the glass, a steady drum roll pushing me forward. It was time to gather the documentation. It was time to find a professional who specialized in making desperate men pay for their arrogance. The sun rose on Friday morning, casting a pale gray light over the wet gravel of my driveway. The tire tracks left by the fleeing locksmith were still visible in the mud near the front porch. I stood by the living room window, holding a cup of black coffee, watching the freezing rain transition into a cold mist. The midnight raid proved a crucial point. My family was no longer operating within the bounds of civil requests or simple emotional manipulation. They were willing to cross strict legal boundaries to seize my property. They were treating my home like an unfortified territory waiting to be conquered. As a data scientist, my world exists primarily in the cloud. I build predictive algorithms and analyze digital trends, but the Pennsylvania legal system does not operate on cloud storage or verbal assumptions. It operates on physical paper. It operates on ink-raised seals and notarized signatures. I needed to translate my digital fortress into a tangible weapon. To understand the severity of my father's actions, one must understand the historical fabric of this state. Pennsylvania was founded on early land grants and strict property rights. In the affluent suburbs surrounding Philadelphia, real estate is treated with a profound, almost religious reverence. An ancestral home is not just an asset, it is a declaration of sovereignty. Wrongful eviction and property fraud are not merely civil disputes here. They are serious offenses that local judges punish with severe prejudice. I spent the next 4 hours building an impenetrable fortress of documentation. I retrieved a thick, heavy-duty binder from my home office supplies. The process of compiling the evidence required a cold, methodical focus. Page 1 was the certified original deed to the house. The heavy parchment bore the raised seal of the county clerk. It contained only one name, my name. Page 2 held the comprehensive title insurance documents, confirming a clear, unencumbered transfer of ownership at the time of my purchase. Pages 3 through 26 consisted of 24 months of consecutive bank statements. I used a yellow highlighter to mark every single outgoing wire transfer related to the property. Each highlighted line proved that every mortgage payment, every property tax installment, and every homeowner insurance premium originated directly from my personal checking account. I printed the cleared checks paid to the contractors who restored the hardwood floors and the plumbers who updated the ancient copper pipes. The financial trail was unbroken. The final section of the binder contained the motive. A crime is just a chaotic event until you introduce the underlying reason for the behavior. I printed the public court dockets detailing my father's default on the Tudor estate. I included the civil complaint exposing Derek's corporate theft and his subsequent termination. I placed each piece of paper into a clear plastic sleeve. When I finished, the binder weighed nearly 3 pounds. It was a physical manifestation of undeniable truth. It was a ledger of facts that no country club rumor could ever erase. I needed a specific type of attorney to handle the impending war. I did not need a friendly family lawyer who would suggest mediation or a gentle compromise. I needed a shark. I called Mr. Caldwell. I knew his reputation from a complex corporate merger my financial technology firm had analyzed a few years prior. Caldwell was a ruthless, no-nonsense real estate attorney operating out of a high-rise building in Center City, Philadelphia. He was known for dismantling fraudulent claims with clinical precision and a distinct lack of empathy for the opposing counsel. I secured a sitter for Leo, a trusted former nanny from the neighborhood who adored him, and drove into the city. Caldwell's office was sparse, intimidating, and smelled of polished mahogany and old paper. There were no family photos on his desk, only neat stacks of legal briefs and a silver pen. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the Philadelphia skyline, but he sat with his back to the glass. I took the seat across from him and slid the thick binder over the smooth surface of his desk. I explained the midnight lockout attempt, the arrival of the emergency locksmith, and the forged narrative my father was peddling to his peers. Caldwell did not interrupt me. He opened the binder. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the office was the turning of plastic sleeves and the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. He read the deed. He traced the highlighted bank transfers with the tip of his silver pen. He studied the court dockets detailing the impending financial ruin of my father and brother-in-law. I watched his eyes scan the pages, noting the subtle shift from passive interest to sharp, focused legal strategy. Caldwell closed the binder. He folded his hands on top of the black cover and looked at me. His expression carried a cold, professional respect. "Your father is banking on the assumption that a postpartum mother is too exhausted to fight back," Caldwell said, his voice flat and authoritative. "He is relying on the illusion of patriarchal authority to bypass the law. What he attempted last night is an illegal self-help eviction. By bringing a locksmith to your primary residence without a court order, he committed a serious offense." Caldwell tapped the cover of the binder. "You are legally untouchable, Ms. Sterling. You hold the title. You have the financial paper trail. He has a fairy tale he tells his friends at the golf course. If he attempts to step foot on your property again to restrict your access, he is trespassing. If he produces any document claiming ownership, he is committing fraud." We drafted a tactical plan. A standard legal response would involve sending a formal cease and desist letter to my father's residence. We decided against it. Warning my father would give him time to fabricate a new strategy, hire his own counsel, or attempt to forge a quitclaim deed behind my back. We would remain silent. We would let them continue operating under the delusion that I was a terrified, isolated target. We would let them walk right into their own trap. When they inevitably escalated their physical takeover, we would have the police and the documentation ready to spring the snare. I paid Caldwell his retainer, secured a digital copy of his business card on my phone, and left the high-rise building with a profound sense of security. The law was a shield they could not pierce. I drove back to the main line feeling ready for a direct physical confrontation. I was prepared for moving trucks' angry demands on my front porch and attempts to breach my doors. I was ready to defend the physical perimeter of my home. But I had underestimated my sister. Caroline realized she could not break my resolve in person. While I was in Philadelphia securing my legal defense, she was sitting in her leased SUV, typing a fictional narrative into her phone. She decided to wage a war in an arena where deeds and bank statements held no immediate power. The social smear campaign had just begun. I returned to the quiet sanctuary of the main line on Friday afternoon, feeling a profound sense of tactical advantage. The physical perimeter of my home was secure, and Mr. Caldwell held the undeniable legal truth in his downtown office. I assumed my family would spend the weekend licking their wounds and plotting a covert legal strategy. I expected them to consult their own attorneys, realize the futility of their position, and perhaps attempt a quiet negotiation. I approached the conflict through the lens of logic. I forgot that my older sister operated in an entirely different theater of war. Caroline possessed no leverage in a courtroom. She held no deeds, no bank statements, and no legal standing. She was, however, a decorated veteran of suburban social warfare. In the affluent enclaves of Pennsylvania, the local country club message boards and private community forums function as a localized judicial system. Reputations are built and dismantled within the comment sections of exclusive neighborhood groups. When Caroline realized she could not breach the heavy oak doors of my house, she pivoted to a weapon she knew how to wield with devastating precision. She decided to dismantle my character. My phone began buzzing incessantly while I was preparing a bottle for Leo in the kitchen. The notifications were not text messages from my parents. They were alerts from a private community group known as the Heritage Estates Circle, a digital gathering place for the prominent families in our zip code. I tapped the screen and opened the application. At the top of the feed sat a lengthy, meticulously crafted post authored by my sister. She had attached a photograph of us from 3 years ago, smiling together at a charity gala, framing the narrative with a visual anchor of sisterly devotion. The text below the image was a masterpiece of manipulative fiction. Caroline wrote that our family was experiencing a profound private tragedy. She claimed that following the birth of my son, I had succumbed to severe tragic postpartum psychosis. She spun a harrowing tale of a young mother losing her grip on reality, claiming I was experiencing delusions of persecution and isolating myself inside the property. Then, she deployed the most insidious lie of all. She stated that the historic stone colonial, the home I had purchased with my own grueling labor, was actually a sanctuary generously procured by our father to ensure my stability. According to her post, I was now squatting in the family estate, refusing medical intervention and locking my relatives out in the freezing rain when they simply tried to check on the baby. She ended the post with a plea for privacy and prayers stating that she and Derek were sacrificing their own comfort to move into the house this weekend. They were doing this, she claimed, to provide me with full-time care and protect infant Leo from his mother's deteriorating mental state. I stood in my kitchen reading the paragraphs of fabricated grief, marveling at the cold calculation required to weaponize mental health. Postpartum struggles are a genuine, terrifying reality for many women, a vulnerability that commands immediate societal sympathy. Caroline hijacked that sympathy to mask a brazen real estate theft. By labeling me as psychotic, she preemptively invalidated any defense I might offer. If I claimed I owned the house, it would be dismissed as a delusion. If I reported them for harassment, it would be viewed as a symptom of paranoia. She was building a social consensus that justified their impending home invasion. She was painting my father not as a midnight trespasser, but as a heartbroken patriarch trying to save his sick daughter. The response from the community was swift and overwhelming. Below the post, dozens of comments accumulated within the hour. Women who sat on the Historical Society board offered their deepest sympathies. Golf partners of my father praised his unwavering dedication to his children. The neighborhood consensus solidified instantly. I was the tragic, broken girl, and my family consisted of benevolent saviors. The true weight of a smear campaign is rarely felt through a screen. It manifests in the physical world, altering the very air around you. On Saturday morning, the autumn sun burned away the lingering frost. I refused to cower inside my home. I bundled Leo into his stroller and walked the 3 blocks to the upscale organic grocery market in the center of our village. It was a routine errand, a deliberate choice to maintain my standard schedule. The moment I pushed the stroller through the sliding glass doors, the atmosphere shifted. The market was bustling with weekend shoppers, many of whom I had known for years. As I navigated the produce aisle, the ambient chatter dropped to a low, unnatural murmur. I reached for a bundle of asparagus and noticed Mrs. Gable, the formidable treasurer of the local garden club, standing near the organic apples. Our eyes met. Usually, she would offer a crisp nod and a comment about the upcoming frost. Today, her gaze darted downward to my son, and her features contorted into a mask of deep, agonizing pity. She offered a tight, sympathetic smile and quickly steered her shopping cart in the opposite direction. It happened again at the checkout counter. Two women from the Historical Society stood in the adjacent lane. I watched their reflections in the polished steel of the pastry case. They were leaning close together, whispering behind their hands, their eyes tracking my every movement as I loaded groceries onto the conveyor belt. When I turned to face them, they abruptly fell silent, offering wide artificial smiles that did not reach their eyes. The gaslighting was working flawlessly. The surrounding community viewed me through the distorted lens my sister had provided. Every quiet moment of my shopping trip was interpreted as a sign of mental fragility. If I looked tired, it was proof of a downward spiral. If I maintained a stoic expression, it was evidence of detachment from reality. They were isolating me in plain sight, wrapping me in a suffocating blanket of social stigma. A weaker person might have cracked under the pressure of those sidelong glances. A typical response would involve logging onto the community forum, typing furious defensive paragraphs, and attaching bank statements for the entire neighborhood to dissect. People who feel misunderstood often possess an overwhelming urge to explain themselves, to shout their truth into the void until someone believes them. I felt no such urge. I pushed my stroller back up the hill toward my slate-roofed colonial, letting the crisp autumn wind clear my mind. In the realm of data science, there is a fundamental principle regarding signal and noise. The signal is the truth, the actionable data. The noise is the random, meaningless variance that surrounds it. When you engage with the noise, you amplify it. You grant it legitimacy. If I logged onto the internet to argue with my sister, I would be entering a debate where she dictated the terms. I would be presenting my certified property deed to an audience of bored suburbanites looking for weekend entertainment. Gossip is just static. It holds no legal jurisdiction. The opinions of the Historical Society women could not drill through my deadbolts, and the pity of the garden club treasurer could not transfer the title of my property. My family was trying to leverage social embarrassment to force a physical surrender. They assumed the crushing weight of public humiliation would compel me to hand over the keys and retreat into the shadows. They failed to realize I did not value their society. I did not care if I was uninvited from the summer galas, and I did not need the approval of the country club elite. I only cared about the physical security of my son and the legal sanctity of my real estate. I maintained an unbroken silence. I did not comment on her posts, I did not delete my social media profiles, and I did not avoid the gaze of my neighbors. I existed in the real world, allowing their digital fiction to burn itself out. My silence unnerved them. By Saturday evening, the lack of a defensive reaction from my side left my family in a strategic vacuum. They had played their most potent social card, anticipating a tearful breakdown or a desperate plea for reconciliation. When the breakdown failed to materialize, the panic within their ranks must have reached a boiling point. The bank foreclosure on their ancestral home was creeping closer with every passing hour. The social smear campaign was a smokescreen, a desperate diversion designed to keep me off balance while they prepared their final maneuver. They realized whispered rumors would not vacate the premises. They needed an instrument that looked like authority. They needed a document that would cow a young mother into submission before the weekend ended. As the sun set on Saturday, I secured the deadbolts and activated the perimeter cameras, knowing the digital war was over. A far more dangerous paper war was about to land right on my doorstep. Sunday morning broke with a deceptive stillness across the Pennsylvania main line. The freezing rain from the previous nights had given way to a brittle, cloudless sky. I woke early, the ambient temperature of the historic stone colonial dipping just enough to make the hardwood floors cold beneath my bare feet. Leo was resting quietly against my shoulder, his small, rhythmic breaths serving as a grounding metronome against the erratic rhythm of my family's ongoing siege. I descended the curved wooden staircase, moving through the quiet house, with the measured, deliberate pace of someone who knows they are being hunted but holds the superior tactical ground. Upon reaching the bottom step, my gaze fell onto the foyer. Resting on the center of the intricate Persian rug bathed in a shaft of pale morning light sat a heavy, cream-colored envelope. It had been slid beneath the thick brass threshold of the oak front door during the night. I approached the object slowly. I did not bend down to retrieve it immediately. I studied it from a standing position, analyzing its physical presence in my home. The envelope was crafted from premium high-weight cardstock, the exact variety my mother utilized for country club gala invitations and holiday correspondence. The irony was palpable. My family was attempting to execute a hostile takeover of my real estate using luxury stationery. I carried my son into the kitchen, secured him in his padded rocker, and returned to the foyer. I picked up the envelope by the very edge. It bore my name printed in sharp, rigid block letters. There was no return address, but a canceled postage stamp sat in the top right corner. The stamp indicated it had passed through the federal postal system before someone, likely my father, decided the mail carrier was too slow and personally shoved it under my door to guarantee immediate delivery. I broke the wax seal, sliding the thick paper from its casing. The document inside was meticulously formatted to mimic a formal judicial order. The header, printed in a bold serif typeface, read, "30-day notice to quit." My eyes scanned the paragraphs, filtering the combative legal jargon. The text cited a failure to pay rent and a breach of family lease agreement. It demanded that I vacate the premises, surrender all keys, and remove my personal belongings by the end of the impending week. The phrasing was deliberately dense, packed with intimidating clauses intended to replicate the weight of genuine jurisprudence. It demanded I surrender all access points, a detail I found particularly amusing, given that my father had just attempted to drill through my deadbolt 48 hours prior. My gaze dropped to the bottom of the page. There, scrawled in black fountain pen ink, was the signature of Richard Sterling. Beneath his name, typed in rigid capital letters, was a title he had bestowed upon himself: legal property owner. I stood in the quiet foyer holding the paper and felt a profound sense of analytical clarity. My father had spent his entire career in commercial development, operating in a sphere where his wealth and social standing insulated him from standard consequences. Men of his generation and status often develop a dangerous cognitive distortion. They believe that if they type something onto formal letterhead and sign their name to it, the universe will bend to make it true. He assumed that presenting a legal-looking document to a young postpartum mother would induce immediate panic. He calculated that my ignorance of the law would blind me to the deception. He expected me to weep, pack my bags, and retreat into the shadows out of sheer terror. I did not panic. I did not shed a tear. I walked into my home office, opened a desk drawer, and retrieved a clear plastic archival sleeve. I carefully slid the cream-colored document into the protective casing, treating it not as a legitimate eviction notice, but as a volatile piece of forensic evidence. In the historic, wealthy suburban areas around Philadelphia, the social and legal frameworks are deeply defined by a multi-generational reverence for land deeds. Ancestral homes are the ultimate symbols of security. Because of this cultural bedrock, the Pennsylvania judicial system treats any manipulation of property rights with severe, unforgiving prejudice. By utilizing the Postal Service to deliver a fraudulent document, and by legally misrepresenting himself as the owner of an estate, he had no rightful claim to my father had just crossed a perilous threshold. He had escalated the conflict from a domestic dispute into the realm of federal and state criminality. He had just committed mail fraud and felony forgery. To a data scientist, a contract is simply an equation. For an equation to balance, the variables must align perfectly. My father had fabricated a lease agreement that never existed in any database. He attached my name to a fictitious financial delinquency without a single bank transfer to support the claim. Furthermore, he forged a declaration of ownership over a historic estate that belonged exclusively to me, contradicting the certified county deed resting safely in my attorney's high-rise office. His equation was built entirely on fictitious data. While they spent their Sunday morning attending church services and projecting the image of a flawless, benevolent dynasty to their peers, they had just initiated a sequence of events that would guarantee their public ruin. I woke up my laptop, the screen illuminating the dark cherry wood of my office. I placed the plastic sleeve onto my flatbed scanner. The machine whirred, capturing the high-resolution image of his fountain pen signature and his fraudulent title. I opened my encrypted email client and drafted a new message to Mr. Caldwell, the ruthless real estate attorney I had retained in Philadelphia. I attached the scanned file. The body of the email contained only 2 sentences. My father delivered this notice this morning. Please advise on the strategic implication. I hit send, the digital packet flying through the ether to land in the inbox of a man who dismantles fraudulent claims for a living. I carried my coffee back to the kitchen, watching the winter sun climb higher over the slate roof. I did not have to wait long. Mr. Caldwell was not a man who observed a day of rest when a vulnerable target presented itself. He viewed litigation not as a profession but as a blood sport. 3 minutes later, my phone vibrated against the marble counter. The notification displayed a new encrypted email from Caldwell. I opened the message. The response was brief, surgical, and deeply satisfying. They just handed us the nail for their own coffin, Caldwell wrote. Let them come. I locked my phone and looked out the window toward the gated driveway. The trap was now fully baited. The digital smear campaign my sister Caroline had waged on the country club message boards was nothing more than a smokescreen. It was a digital distraction designed to isolate me, damage my credibility, and keep me off balance while my father prepared this final, desperate legal maneuver. They believed they had outsmarted me. They believed their fabricated paperwork would serve as an impenetrable shield when the moving trucks arrived on Tuesday. They had no idea they had just handed a data scientist the exact variable required to destroy their entire operation. The silence in the house felt different now. It was no longer the silence of a siege, but the quiet stillness of a predator waiting in the tall grass. The weekend was drawing to a close. The pieces were locked into place on the board. I poured the remainder of my coffee into the sink and went back to the nursery to check on my son, knowing that tomorrow the true depth of my family's desperation would be revealed by an unlikely source within the community. Every insular, affluent community possesses a quiet gatekeeper of secrets. On the surface, the Pennsylvania Main Line appears to be governed by the loud, performative displays of wealth favored by my sister and her country club peers. They operate under the assumption that social influence is generated by driving imported vehicles, wearing designer labels, and hosting extravagantly catered events. However, true power in these historic suburbs does not reside in dining rooms or on golf courses. It resides in the quiet, climate-controlled archives of the local historical society. The women who manage the generational records do not engage in digital gossip or participate in online community forums. They observe the bedrock foundation of our society. They monitor the deeds, the estate transfers, the zoning permits, and the property tax rolls. Our local gatekeeper was a 70-year-old widow named Mrs. Abernathy. Monday afternoon arrived with a heavy, oppressive, overcast sky that threatened snow. The temperature had dropped significantly, freezing the lingering moisture on the bare branches of the oak trees lining my driveway. I was standing in the kitchen, sterilizing baby bottles and mentally preparing for the confrontation scheduled for the following morning. My security application chimed softly from the marble counter. I tapped the screen to check the digital feed. Mrs. Abernathy stood on my flagstone porch. She wore a tailored tweed coat and held a glass casserole dish tightly covered in aluminum foil. In our community, delivering a baked meal to a new mother is a mandatory social ritual, a gesture of polite solidarity. Yet, given the vicious online smear campaign Caroline had launched over the weekend, a visit from the head of the Historical Society was a significant anomaly. I unlocked the heavy oak door and invited her inside out of the biting cold. Mrs. Abernathy stepped into the foyer. She did not offer the condescending, pitiful smile I had received from the women at the grocery market the previous day. Her gaze was sharp, analytical, and remarkably clear. She wiped her leather shoes on the entrance mat and handed me the warm glass dish. She complimented the restoration work I had completed on the original crown molding, noting the precise shade of the historic paint I had selected for the entryway. I thanked her for the meal and for her attention to the architectural details. I expected her to offer a polite farewell and return to her vehicle. Instead, she stepped closer, bridging the physical distance between us, and glanced cautiously toward the closed living room doors. Her voice dropped to a low conspiratorial whisper. She told me her eldest son held a senior administrative position at the county clerk office downtown. The clerk office is the central nervous system of Pennsylvania real estate, the exact location where property titles are recorded and mortgages are legally bound. Mrs. Abernathy looked me directly in the eyes. She informed me that my father had walked into that government building early this morning. Richard did not visit the clerk to request a public record or pay a municipal fee. He arrived with a notarized document he intended to file into the official county registry. He attempted to record a fraudulent quitclaim deed, a legal instrument designed to swiftly transfer the ownership of a property from one party to another without the standard warranty protections. The gravity of her revelation anchored my feet to the hardwood floor. A quitclaim deed offers no guarantees regarding the title, making it the preferred tool for transferring real estate between trusted family members. My father had forged my signature to transfer the equity of my historic stone colonial entirely into his own name. Mrs. Abernathy continued her quiet report. She explained that Richard was attempting to leverage the stolen equity of my home to secure a massive expedited second mortgage. He required a sudden influx of unencumbered cash to satisfy his predatory commercial lenders and cover the staggering financial debts generated by Derek and his failed corporate embezzlement scheme. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with terrifying precision. The logistics of their invasion finally made perfect nefarious sense. My family did not merely want to occupy my house to maintain an illusion of prestige. They needed the property completely vacant because commercial lenders require physical appraisals before approving high-value equity loans. An independent bank appraiser could not inspect a historic colonial while the true legal owner was sitting in the living room holding an infant. They needed me to pack my belongings and disappear into a rented apartment so Richard could walk the bank officials through the empty rooms, posing as the sole proprietor of a magnificent unburdened asset. My father was attempting to steal my entire net worth to pay a ransom for his own terrible financial decisions. The forgery I had discovered on Sunday morning was just the prelude. The quitclaim deed was the execution of the heist. If his plan succeeded, I would be stripped of my home and my equity, left with nothing, while my family used my capital to save their ancestral Tudor estate from foreclosure. Mrs. Abernathy reached out and gently patted my hand. Her touch was firm and reassuring. She told me the old families of this town know exactly who pays the property taxes every quarter. She advised me not to let them push me out of my rightful home. With that single profound statement, the head of the Historical Society dismantled the entire psychological war my mother and sister had waged against me. The established hierarchy of the neighborhood did not believe Caroline and her fabricated story of postpartum psychosis. The true gatekeepers recognized the facts. They understood that the loud, desperate clamor of my family was nothing more than the thrashing of a drowning dynasty. Mrs. Abernathy buttoned her tweed coat, offered a respectful nod, and departed through the heavy oak door. I carried the warm casserole dish into the kitchen and set it on the island. I stood in the silence of my home, feeling a cold, impenetrable armor settle over my shoulders. The conflict was no longer a domestic dispute over living arrangements. It was no longer a matter of setting familial boundaries or demanding personal respect from my parents. My father had actively attempted to defraud the county government. He had committed a high-stakes financial crime, in progress a desperate gamble that carried a mandatory federal prison sentence. The parameters of the engagement had shifted entirely. I was no longer merely defending my personal space. I was protecting my financial future and the legacy I was building for my son. I retrieved my laptop and sent a secure encrypted message to Mr. Caldwell updating him on the attempted quitclaim filing. He replied almost immediately confirming that the county clerk would automatically flag the forged document due to the legal holds we had already placed on the title the previous Friday. My father's fraudulent filing would remain suspended in the municipal system, serving as permanent, undeniable evidence of his felony. They had locked themselves inside a burning building of their own design. They were operating under the delusion that their crimes were hidden, trusting that their social standing would shield them from bureaucratic scrutiny. The sun dipped below the tree line, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawns of the neighborhood. I checked the perimeter cameras one final time. I verified the heavy brass locks on every window and door. I prepared a bottle for Leo and sat in the rocking chair in the nursery, listening to the winter wind rattle the antique glass. The trap was set, the evidence was secured. The authorities were unknowingly primed by the very documents my father had submitted to the clerk. Tuesday morning was rapidly approaching. The moving truck was scheduled to arrive at dawn, bringing my entire family right to the threshold of the fortress they intended to conquer. Tomorrow was moving day, and I was ready to welcome them. Tuesday morning broke with a fragile, pale light that did little to warm the freezing Pennsylvania air. The historic stone colonial sat quietly under the overcast sky, holding its breath against the impending winter. I stood in the darkened living room, the thick velvet drapes pulled tightly shut, leaving only a narrow sliver of glass exposed for observation. I held Leo securely against my chest. His soft, rhythmic breathing anchored me to the present reality, a steady counterpoint to the turbulent events approaching my doorstep. The silence of the affluent neighborhood shattered just before 9 o'clock. A heavy diesel engine rumbled down the pristine street, the sound vibrating through the antique glass panes of the window. A professional commercial transport vehicle, painted in bright, cheerful corporate colors, backed slowly into my long gravel driveway. The driver misjudged the turning radius, sending the dual rear tires over the edge of the crushed stone border, flattening a row of dormant hydrangeas. The casual destruction of the landscaping served as a fitting prelude for the invasion. Directly behind the transport vehicle, a sleek black luxury sedan rolled onto the property. My father drove his posture rigid behind the steering wheel, projecting an aura of effortless command. Catherine sat in the passenger seat wearing a tailored wool coat. Her hair was styled flawlessly for what she presumed would be a triumphant social victory. She viewed the impending eviction not as a tragedy, but as a necessary correction to the family hierarchy. Trailing them closely was the leased SUV belonging to Carolyn and Derek. They parked in a synchronized formation, occupying the driveway with the practiced arrogance of people who believed they owned the ground beneath their tires. They stepped out of their vehicles into the biting wind. Caroline adjusted her designer scarf, her face radiating a smug, eager anticipation. She had spent her entire life stepping into spaces prepared for her by other people, and today was meant to be the ultimate acquisition. Derek stood beside her, attempting to project the quiet confidence of a successful executive. To the casual observer, he looked like a wealthy suburban father taking charge of his destiny. Only I knew the truth hidden behind his tailored suit. He was a man facing corporate ruin and criminal exposure, a disgraced employee seeking shelter in a house he intended to steal. They were treating a forced displacement like a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The true depth of my father's calculation revealed itself a moment later. A local police cruiser turned off the main road and parked near the edge of the property line. The red and blue light bar rested dormant on the roof of the vehicle. Two uniformed officers stepped out onto the wet asphalt, adjusting their duty belts. Richard had escalated the theater of his false narrative by weaponizing municipal law enforcement. In his mind, civil disputes required an audience of authority. He had undoubtedly contacted the precinct earlier that morning. He would have spun a tragic rehearsed fiction about a mentally unstable daughter refusing to vacate a property he generously maintained. He wanted the officers present not for safety, but for intimidation. He intended to use their badges as leverage, assuming the sight of a uniform would force a terrified young mother to surrender her keys without a fight. He walked toward the officers, extending a hand in greeting. He played the role of the weary, benevolent patriarch, forced to make difficult decisions for the good of his sick child with sickening precision. The officers nodded, their expressions a mix of professional detachment and quiet sympathy for the older gentleman. They followed him up the driveway, forming a procession behind my family. I watched the pantomime unfold from the shadows of my living room. They marched up the flagstone path toward the front porch. The moving crew stood by their truck, lowering the hydraulic ramp and retrieving heavy steel dollies. They waited for the patriarch to open the door to his castle and grant them access to the interior. My family expected to find a house in chaotic disarray. They anticipated unlocked doors, half-packed boxes, and a weeping broken woman begging for mercy on the foyer rug. They thought the relentless pressure of the weekend smear campaign, combined with the forged eviction notice, had shattered my resolve. They believed the presence of the police would serve as the final crushing blow to my resistance. Instead, they walked up to an impenetrable fortress. I had spent the early morning hours securing the perimeter with clinical precision. The heavy brass deadbolts on every exterior entrance were firmly engaged. The window shades were drawn tight across the first and second floors, blocking any visual access to the interior layout. Above their heads, the high-definition security cameras tracked their every movement. Small red indicator lights blinked steadily, recording the entire event for the meticulous legal file Mr. Caldwell was maintaining in his downtown Philadelphia office. Richard reached the top step of the porch. He did not bother to ring the doorbell. He reached into the pocket of his tailored trench coat, his hand searching for a spare key he had never possessed. A frown creased his forehead when he found the pocket empty. He reached out and turned the heavy brass handle of the front door, expecting the latch to yield instantly to his authority. The metal mechanism held firm, clicking loudly in the cold air. The door did not move a single inch. Behind him, Catherine frowned. Her polished composure slipped slightly as the chill wind whipped her styled hair across her face. She pulled her coat tighter, looking around the porch with a growing sense of indignity. Caroline and Derek exchanged a confused glance, the smug anticipation fading into early irritation. The police officers stood at the base of the stone steps. They watched the patriarch struggle to enter his own supposed domain. The moving crew leaned against their dollies near the crushed hydrangeas, sensing the unexpected delay in their workday. I stood in the dark watching the digital feed on my phone screen. The camera angle provided a perfect, unobstructed view of my father's escalating frustration. He jiggled the brass handle again, using more force this time. The thick oak door remained unyielding. For decades, Richard Sterling had operated under the assumption that his will alone was sufficient to open any door he wished to walk through. He was a man who built his identity on the illusion of control. Now, standing in front of his peers, his family, and local law enforcement, that illusion was encountering a physical barrier it could not penetrate. The stage was set flawlessly. The audience was in position. The trap I had spent days constructing was fully primed. I held Leo closer, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my ribs. I did not feel fear. I felt the calm, cold certainty of a data scientist watching a predictive model play out exactly as calculated. My father raised his fist, preparing to strike the wood. He was about to demand entry to a kingdom he did not own, and I was finally ready to answer him. The heavy oak front door shuddered under the impact of my father's fist. The sound reverberated through the quiet foyer, a harsh, rhythmic thud that threatened to disturb the fragile peace of the morning. Richard pounded his knuckles against the thick wood, treating the historic barrier like a temporary obstacle he could simply batter into submission. The brass hinges groaned in protest, but the heavy-duty deadbolts held firm, anchoring the door to the stone frame of the house. "Eleanor, open this door immediately, the police are here!" His voice boomed through the thick timber. The demand echoed across the pristine lawns of the neighborhood, slicing through the freezing Pennsylvania air. He pitched his tone to project righteous indignation, ensuring the nearby residents and the commercial moving crew understood he was a patriarch, attempting to handle a difficult domestic situation. He wanted an audience for his final triumph. He wanted the neighbors peering through their sheer curtains to witness his authority over a disobedient child. I stood perfectly still on the Persian rug in the center of the foyer. The ambient temperature of the house felt distinct and separate from the bitter cold, radiating just inches away on the other side of the threshold. I held Leo securely against my chest, feeling the soft rhythm of his heartbeat beneath his fleece sleeper. My son shifted slightly, letting out a quiet sigh, entirely insulated from the storm raging on our front step. The scent of lavender baby lotion provided a stark contrast to the metallic tension winding tight in my own chest. Through the high-definition security application on my phone, I watched the scene unfold with clinical detachment. The two uniformed officers stepped onto the flagstone porch, their black boots crunching on the thin layer of ice. They exchanged a brief, uncomfortable glance. Law enforcement in this affluent jurisdiction rarely dealt with hostile evictions on a Tuesday morning. They were accustomed to mediating noise complaints or securing perimeters for charity galas. Standing on my porch, they looked uneasy, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. They were prepared to act on the forged eviction notice my father had undoubtedly described to them, yet they remained hesitant, sensing an anomaly in the narrative. Richard stepped back from the door, his chest heaving slightly under his tailored wool coat. He turned to the officers, gesturing wildly toward the unyielding oak. He was putting on a theatrical performance portraying the exhausted, benevolent father forced to employ municipal resources to save his delusional daughter. Caroline and Derek huddled behind him, wrapping their designer scarves tighter against the biting wind. Their faces were flushed with a mixture of cold and eager anticipation. They were waiting for the inevitable moment when the authorities would force me into the daylight. Caroline even clutched a small designer handbag, looking as though she were preparing to step over the threshold and immediately begin directing the painters. I did not open the door. I did not raise my voice to argue through the wood. An emotional response is a vulnerability, a leak in the armor that a predator will exploit. I reached out and pressed the activation button for the exterior intercom system mounted on the foyer wall. The small green indicator light blinked, signaling an open channel to the speaker above the front porch. I leaned close to the microphone. I modulated my breathing, ensuring my vocal cords carried no trace of fear, no hesitation, and no sorrow. I wanted to sound like a machine delivering a mathematical certainty. "Check the deed," I said. 3 words. I released the button. The electronic chime signaled the end of the transmission. The metallic, disembodied sound of my voice crackled through the cold air outside. The words hung over the porch, slicing through the tension like a scalpel. On the security screen, I watched my father react. He scoffed loudly, a harsh, dismissive sound that conveyed volumes of arrogance. He shook his head, offering the police officers a patronizing smile intended to elicit their sympathy. He reached into the deep inner pocket of his trench coat and produced the heavy, cream-colored envelope. He withdrew the forged legal document with a flourish, snapping the thick paper in the crisp wind. "She is confused, officers," Richard said, handing the fraudulent lease agreement to the lead patrolman. "This is my property. Here is the formal notice to quit signed and dated. We need to gain entry to ensure the safety of the infant." The officer accepted the document, pulling a penlight from his vest to examine the text in the overcast morning light. He read the aggressive clauses, the fabricated rental arrears, and the bold signature claiming legal ownership. The paperwork looked official. The presentation was flawless. However, data science relies on the principle of preemptive modeling. You do not wait for a flawed variable to disrupt the system. You neutralize the variable before the system activates. My father did not know that precisely 1 hour prior to his arrival, I had composed a highly detailed encrypted email directed to the captain of the local police precinct. I had not sent a frantic plea for help. I had sent an organized, undeniable ledger of facts. The email contained high-resolution attachments of my certified original deed, the comprehensive title insurance policy, and 24 months of bank statements proving my exclusive financial stewardship of the estate. Crucially, I had also attached the scanned copy of the forged 30-day notice my father had slid under my door on Sunday. I outlined the exact statutes regarding mail fraud and felony forgery in the state of Pennsylvania. I informed the captain that an attempted illegal lockout was scheduled for 9 o'clock and that the perpetrators intended to misuse municipal police resources to facilitate their crime. The officers on my porch were operating under a significant information delay. The patrolmen had been dispatched based on my father's initial frantic emergency call. They had not yet received the updated briefing from their precinct commander. I watched the lead officer trace my father's signature on the forged paper. The officer frowned, reaching for the radio microphone clipped to his shoulder. He was preparing to run the names through dispatch, preparing to ask the very questions my email had already answered. Before the officer could press the transmission button, a sharp, piercing ringtone pierced the quiet tension on the porch. The sound emanated from my father's pocket. Richard paused, clearly annoyed by the interruption. He retrieved his smartphone, glancing at the screen. The caller ID glowed brightly in the gray morning light. It was his personal real estate attorney, the man tasked with finalizing the desperate financial maneuvers required to save the Tudor estate from imminent foreclosure. Richard answered the call, bringing the device to his ear. He maintained his smug, confident posture, assuming the attorney was calling to confirm a routine detail. "Yes, speak quickly," Richard said, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "I am in the middle of securing the property with the authorities." I kept my eyes locked on the digital feed, watching the microscopic shifts in my father's physical demeanor. The voice on the other end of the line was frantic. Even through the thick glass of my windows, I could not hear the specific words, but I could interpret the physical response they provoked. The attorney was calling directly from the county clerk office downtown. He was calling to report a catastrophic failure. Mrs. Abernathy had been entirely correct. The Historical Society gatekeeper had warned me about the fraudulent quitclaim deed my father attempted to file. My attorney, Mr. Caldwell, had ensured that the county registry flagged the forgery the moment it entered the municipal system. The clerk had not only rejected the transfer of my equity, they had impounded the falsified document as evidence of a high-stakes financial crime. The bank loan Richard desperately needed was dead. The foreclosure on his ancestral home was now a certainty. The transformation occurred in a matter of seconds. The confident, arrogant set of my father's shoulders collapsed. The haughty tilt of his chin vanished. I watched the blood rapidly drain from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly shade of gray. The illusion of his power, carefully constructed over decades of country club dinners and commercial real estate deals, evaporated into the freezing Pennsylvania wind. He stared blankly at the police officers, but his eyes were unfocused, seeing only the inescapable reality of his own ruin. He opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords failed to produce a sound. The magnitude of his exposure had finally eclipsed his ego. His right arm, holding the smartphone to his ear, slowly lost its tension. The muscles in his hand went entirely limp. The expensive device slipped from his grasp. It fell through the cold air in slow motion. The phone struck the hard flagstone of the porch with a sharp, sudden crack. The screen shattered upon impact, sending a spiderweb of fractured glass scattering across the stone surface. Richard did not look down at the broken device. He stood frozen, a hollow shell of a patriarch staring at the heavy oak door he could no longer conquer. The officers stepped back, sensing the sudden drastic shift in the environment. The moving crew stopped leaning on their dollies. Caroline and Derek stopped shivering, their confused faces turning toward the broken man standing on the stoop. The silence that followed was profound. It was the silence of a kingdom falling. I held Leo a little tighter, resting my hand on the smooth brass of the deadbolt, knowing the time had come to step out of the shadows. The sound of shattered glass on the flagstone porch lingered in the freezing air. My father stared at his broken mobile phone, the physical manifestation of his ruined scheme, lying in sharp, jagged shards at his leather shoes. The silence that followed the impact was dense and suffocating. I did not give him time to recover his composure or attempt to spin a new narrative. I reached out and turned the heavy brass latch of the front door. The deadbolts clicked, a sharp echoing mechanism that signaled the end of the siege. I pulled the thick oak door inward. The bitter winter wind rushed into the foyer, carrying the scent of wet pine needles and diesel exhaust from the idling moving truck. I stepped onto the threshold, holding Leo securely wrapped in a thick fleece blanket. I did not step out alone. Mr. Caldwell moved from the shadows of the hallway to stand beside me. The ruthless real estate attorney had not driven his car up my driveway. Anticipating a blockade, he had parked 2 streets over and walked through the rear garden gate an hour before the transport vehicle arrived. He had been sitting quietly at my kitchen island, drinking coffee and reviewing his meticulously organized legal binder, waiting for the precise moment to spring the trap. Caldwell stepped onto the porch. He wore a charcoal wool suit and carried himself with the lethal, unhurried grace of a predator who has already cornered his prey. The 2 patrolmen who had been watching my father unravel turned their attention to the new arrival. They recognized the posture of a seasoned litigator immediately. Caldwell did not raise his voice. He did not need to shout to command the space. He walked directly to the lead police officer and extended a thick, certified folder bearing the raised seal of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Officers, Caldwell said, his voice carrying a crisp, resonant authority that carried easily to the edge of the lawn. You are looking at the sole legal owner of this property. The man standing beside you is attempting felony forgery and real estate fraud. The lead officer took the folder. He opened the cover, the wind catching the edge of the plastic sleeves. The first page was the certified original deed. The embossed county seal caught the gray morning light. The officer read my name, Eleanor Sterling, printed clearly on the ownership line. He flipped to the second page, scanning the title, insurance documents, and the highlighted bank statements proving an unbroken chain of financial stewardship. The officer then looked down at the cream-colored envelope in his own left hand. He looked at the 30-day notice to quit the document my father had provided just minutes earlier. The officer read the signature at the bottom where Richard Sterling had brazenly declared himself the legal property owner. The dynamic on the porch flipped in a fraction of a second. The police officers realized they had been manipulated. My father had summoned them under false pretenses, attempting to use their badges to facilitate a high-stakes financial crime. The officers stepped away from Richard, creating a distinct physical boundary. They rested their hands cautiously on their duty belts, shifting their posture from mediators to enforcers of the law. Mr. Sterling, you need to step off this property immediately, the lead officer commanded. His tone was no longer polite, it was a strict, unyielding directive. Richard opened his mouth, trying to summon the patriarchal authority that had shielded him for decades. He looked at the officers, then at Caldwell, and finally at me. He searched for a compliant daughter and found a fortified wall. No words came out. The reality of his impending bankruptcy and his criminal exposure paralyzed his vocal cords. The collapse of his empire sent a shockwave through the rest of the family. Derek, standing a few feet behind his father-in-law, performed a rapid, cowardly calculus. Derek knew his own history. He knew about the corporate embezzlement allegations waiting in his recent past. He recognized that if the police decided to escalate the situation and run identification checks, his outstanding liens and legal vulnerabilities would be exposed on a public radio frequency. Derek did not try to defend his wife. He did not try to support the patriarch who had ruined himself to fund his failed startup. Derek took 2 steps backward, his eyes darting nervously toward the street. He turned around and walked briskly toward his leased SUV, abandoning the confrontation to save his own skin. Caroline watched her husband retreat. The polished golden couple facade she had spent her adult life curating cracked and fell apart. She looked at the police officers, at the thick legal binder in their hands, and at the unblinking lens of the security camera mounted above the door. The truth of their poverty and their failure washed over her. Caroline let out a high-pitched, genuine sob of panic. It was not a calculated tear for a country club audience. It was the raw, guttural sound of a woman watching her social standing disintegrate. She raised a trembling hand to her mouth, her designer scarf slipping off her shoulder. The kingdom she felt so entitled to inherit was burning down around her. Catherine remained frozen near the edge of the porch. The grand social architect of the family stood paralyzed in her wool coat. She stared at the moving crew. The commercial movers had lowered their dollies and were watching the drama unfold with wide eyes. They were blue-collar workers who recognized a fraudulent eviction when they saw one. Catherine then looked toward the street. The commotion had drawn an audience. The piercing siren from the midnight raid and the arrival of the police cruiser had alerted the neighborhood. Several residents of the exclusive mainline community had stepped out of their homes. Mrs. Abernathy stood near her wrought iron gate holding the morning newspaper. Mrs. Gable, the garden club treasurer who had offered me such profound pity at the grocery market, was walking her dog along the sidewalk, her jaw slack with shock. The neighbors were witnessing the public execution of the Sterling legacy. They were watching the patriarch, the man who boasted about his generosity and his commercial real estate empire, being ordered off a property by armed police officers. They saw the golden daughter weeping on the wet flagstone while her husband cowered in a vehicle. Richard picked up the pieces of his shattered phone with trembling hands. He did not look at me again. He turned and walked down the flagstone path, his shoulders hunched against the biting wind. He looked small, defeated, and profoundly old. He walked past the idling diesel truck, past the crushed hydrangeas, and climbed into the driver's seat of his sedan. Catherine followed him in silence. Caroline stumbled down the steps, her boots slipping slightly on the ice, and ran toward the SUV where Derek sat waiting with the engine running. Mr. Caldwell closed his briefcase. He thanked the officers for their time and their swift assessment of the situation. The patrolman offered a respectful nod, returned the fraudulent eviction notice to Caldwell as evidence, and walked back to their cruiser. I stood on the threshold of my historic home, holding my son. The air felt lighter, cleansed of the suffocating pressure my family had imposed for weeks. The moving truck shifted into gear, the driver realizing the contract was null and void, and rolled slowly out of the driveway. The audience of neighbors lingered for a moment, processing the stark truth that had just rewritten the social hierarchy of their enclave before retreating into their own houses. The invasion was over, the physical threat was neutralized, and the legal snare had snapped shut with devastating precision. I stepped back into the warmth of the foyer and secured the heavy brass deadbolt. The conflict on the porch had concluded, but the ripple effects of their exposure were just beginning to gather momentum. Their ruin would not be contained to my front lawn. The consequences of their fraud were about to tear through the financial and social fabric of their entire lives. The destruction of a carefully curated life does not happen in a single chaotic moment. It happens as a cascading sequence of structural failures, much like a flawed algorithm processing corrupted data. The confrontation on my flagstone porch was merely the catalyst. The true unraveling began 48 hours later. By Wednesday morning, the local police inquiry into the forged eviction notice had escalated far beyond a simple municipal dispute. Mr. Caldwell had ensured the precinct captain understood the broader implications of the fabricated document. The local authorities forwarded the file to the county district attorney to establish the motive behind the forgery. That routine administrative transfer triggered a devastating chain reaction. Investigators began pulling financial records to understand why a prominent commercial real estate developer would risk a felony charge to seize his daughter's house. The inquiry inevitably intersected with the quiet, confidential settlement Derek had reached with his former employer. Law enforcement requested documentation regarding Derek's termination. The boutique investment bank, eager to avoid any association with an active criminal investigation, abandoned their discretion. They handed over the internal audits detailing the corporate theft. The quiet allegations of embezzlement instantly became a matter of public record. A formal indictment was filed in the state registry. In the corporate financial sector, a public theft charge is an indelible stain. Trust is the only currency that matters in investment banking. Derek lost his pristine reputation overnight. He became entirely unemployable. The sleek executive persona he had cultivated for years dissolved, leaving behind a disgraced man facing insurmountable legal debts and the prospect of a lengthy trial. The exposure of Derek's crimes acted as an accelerant for my father's ruin. The commercial lenders holding Richard's toxic loans recognized the sudden legal peril surrounding their guarantor. Banks do not operate on nostalgia or country club prestige. They operate on risk assessment. The lenders accelerated the collection process, officially registering the default on the municipal dockets. The local county ledger is published every Thursday morning. It is a dry, monochrome publication containing zoning updates, municipal ordinances, and foreclosure notices. For the old families of our affluent suburb, reading the ledger is a weekly ritual. When the new edition arrived on the pristine driveways of the neighborhood, the Sterling family name was printed in stark black ink under the impending sheriff sales column. The bank had initiated formal foreclosure proceedings on my parents' ancestral Tudor home. The 30-day countdown began ticking. The social exile in our Pennsylvania enclave was swift, silent, and merciless. The community did not stage a dramatic confrontation. They simply severed all ties with lethal efficiency. Wealthy neighborhoods protect their exclusivity by pruning away any dead branches. The first blow landed on Catherine. She received a polite, briskly worded email from the board of directors at the County Historical Society. The board suggested that given her pressing family matters, a quiet resignation from her chairperson position would be the most dignified course of action. She was stripped of her social authority in a single digital correspondence. The country club followed suit a few days later. Membership in that institution requires more than just capital. It demands an unblemished public image. Richard and Catherine had fallen behind on their exorbitant monthly dues months ago, a fact the club had politely ignored while Richard maintained his illusion of success. Once the foreclosure notice hit the public ledger, the grace period vanished. Their membership was formally revoked. The wrought iron gates of the only world they valued swung shut, locking them out permanently. The financial reality of their situation descended rapidly. They possessed no liquid assets, no viable credit, and no social allies willing to extend a lifeline. The luxury vehicles parked in their driveway were repossessed by the leasing companies before the end of the month. The sprawling Tudor estate, with its manicured gardens and generations of history, was surrendered to the bank. The loss of the physical property forced a profound poetic reckoning. They needed shelter. They scoured the rental markets in the affluent suburbs, but their shattered credit scores and pending indictments rendered them untouchable to any reputable leasing agent on the main line. They were forced to look beyond the manicured boundaries of their privileged enclave. They pooled their remaining meager resources. The combined funds of a disgraced real estate developer, an exiled socialite, a fraudulent executive, and a vain sister were barely sufficient to secure a standard lease in the urban center. They ended up signing a contract for a cramped, cheap two-bedroom apartment in the dense downtown district. It was the exact type of dwelling Richard had so callously ordered me and my newborn to disappear into just weeks prior. The universe has a remarkable sense of symmetry. The punishment matched the intended crime with flawless precision. Richard and Catherine took one bedroom. Caroline and Derek squeezed into the other. 4 adults accustomed to sprawling estates and private country club lounges were now confined to a few hundred square feet of cheap linoleum and thin drywall. The ambient noise of the city replaced the quiet rustle of ancient oak trees. The view of luxury manicured lawns was replaced by a brick alleyway. The community Caroline had tried to weaponize against me simply turned its back on them. The neighbors who had offered me pitiful glances at the grocery store now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact with my mother if they happened to see her packing the last of her belongings. The whisper campaigns faded, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the public record. I tracked the progression of their downfall through the digital court dockets and the local real estate listings. I did not feel a sense of triumphant glee. I felt the quiet, steady satisfaction of an algorithm functioning exactly as designed. The noise of their gaslighting, their threats, and their emotional extortion had been filtered out. The data did not lie. The certified deeds, the bank statements, and the unredacted ledgers had spoken louder than any of their polished country club fictions. They had attempted to burn my life to the ground to keep themselves warm, and the wind had simply shifted, blowing the flames back onto their own fragile house of cards. The dust of their collapse eventually settled, leaving me alone in the quiet sanctuary of my historic home. The winter deepened, coating the slate roof in a thick layer of pristine snow. The threat was neutralized, but the psychological residue of their betrayal lingered in the silence of the empty rooms. I focused on my son, on the steady rhythm of my career, and on fortifying the life I had built. I assumed the physical distance and the permanent social barrier would be enough to keep the ghosts of my family at bay. I underestimated the sheer boundless audacity of a man who still believed he was owed a legacy. The changing seasons brought a final, unexpected communication testing the ultimate strength of the boundaries I had drawn. A full revolution of the calendar has passed since the diesel engine of the commercial transport truck faded down my street. It is late October again. The autumn air carries the same crisp bite, but the environment inside my historic stone colonial is fundamentally altered. I am sitting in the sunlit conservatory at the rear of the house. The morning sun filters through the restored leaded glass, casting geometric patterns of warm light across the intricate weave of the Persian rug. Leo is no longer a fragile newborn wrapped in fleece. He is a robust, curious 14-month-old. He sits on the floor deeply focused on stacking painted wooden blocks. He balances a blue square on top of a red cylinder, his small hands moving with a steady, quiet determination. The house hums with a profound, impenetrable tranquility. The heavy brass deadbolts remain engaged, but they no longer serve as barricades against an impending siege. They are simply the standard boundaries of a secure, sovereign life. The property is mine, held free and clear, fortified by truth and maintained by my own labor. The social ecosystem of the Pennsylvania Main Line adjusted to the new reality with ruthless efficiency. The prominent families who once viewed me through the distorted lens of my sister and her fabricated smear campaign now offer crisp, polite nods when I walk through the village square. Mrs. Abernathy occasionally drops by to deliver a jar of preserves, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken pact between homeowners. The community values preservation and authenticity above all else. By defending the physical and legal integrity of my home against a fraudulent invasion, I earned a permanent, undeniable place within their ranks. I do not attend their charity galas, nor do I seek their validation in the country club dining rooms, but their collective respect acts as a tangible shield. The toxic noise my parents and sister constantly generated has been permanently muted. They are ghosts, exiled to a cramped urban perimeter miles away from the manicured lawns they once believed they were destined to rule. The final test of my engineered piece arrived yesterday afternoon in the metal mailbox at the end of my gravel driveway. I walked down to collect the daily correspondence and found a standard thin white envelope mixed among the utility bills and neighborhood newsletters. It lacked the premium weight and the embossed texture of the luxury cardstock my family used to favor for their formal invitations. The return address, printed in the upper corner, bore a harsh numeric street designation located deep within the dense downtown district. I recognized the penmanship immediately. The sharp, rigid block letters belonged to Richard Sterling. The ink was slightly smeared across the zip code, indicating a hurried or unsteady hand. Even without breaking the seal, I could calculate the exact contents of the letter. Predictive modeling relies on historical behavioral data, and my father and his tactical patterns were painfully transparent. The statute of limitations on his pride had expired. The crushing reality of a two-bedroom apartment, shared with a disgraced son-in-law and a furious fallen socialite, had finally broken his ego. He was reaching out. He would frame the correspondence as a magnanimous olive branch, a desperate plea for familial reconciliation. He would invent a minor medical scare to elicit sympathy. He would invoke the concept of a grandfather needing to know his grandson. He would weave a detailed narrative of forgiveness and second chances. Buried beneath the sentimental rhetoric, there would be a specific, desperate financial request. A loan to secure a new lease away from his toxic son-in-law, a down payment for a reliable vehicle, or a capital injection to float a new, fictitious business venture. He viewed my restored equity not as my sanctuary, but as his remaining untapped reserve. I stood in the driveway holding the thin paper. The cold wind ruffled the edges of the envelope. I waited for the familiar physiological response that used to accompany any interaction with my parents. I anticipated the sudden spike in my pulse, the tight knot of anxiety forming in my stomach, or the heavy weight of ingrained lifelong guilt. I closed my eyes and monitored my internal state. My heart rate remained perfectly steady. My breathing was slow and even. I felt no anger toward the man who tried to steal my future. I felt no lingering sadness for the father I had lost, because that benevolent father had never truly existed outside of his own curated fictions. I felt no guilt for surviving the fire they had deliberately set to burn me alive. I felt nothing at all. The emotional ledger was entirely blank. They were no longer family. They were simply hazardous variables I had permanently removed from my dataset. I carried the mail back up the driveway, walking past the long row of hydrangeas that had grown back thicker and more resilient after being crushed by the transport truck tires a year prior. I bypassed the kitchen and walked directly into my dark cherry wood office. I approached the heavy-duty paper shredder positioned beside my mahogany desk. I did not open the envelope. Reading his fabricated apologies would grant him a voice in my home, a privilege he permanently forfeited the night he brought a drill to my front door. I aligned the edge of the cheap white paper with the insertion slot. The mechanical sensors engaged. The steel blades caught the envelope, pulling it downward with a satisfying industrial hum. I watched the sharp metal teeth slice through the paper, the ink, and the desperate pleas hidden inside. The machine processed the document in a matter of seconds, transforming the last remnants of the Sterling dynasty into a pile of meaningless, disconnected confetti. The noise ceased, leaving the office wrapped in a pristine, unbroken silence. My profession requires me to extract meaning from complex systems, to find the truth hidden in the numbers. The ordeal with my family taught me the ultimate, unvarnished truth of the world they worshipped. On the Pennsylvania Main Line and in life itself, genuine security is never found in shared bloodlines, whispered legacies, or superficial social standing. Those elements are volatile. They fluctuate based on rumor debt and the fragile egos of desperate people. Real security is tangible. It is found in the indisputable clarity of a notarized deed. It is found in the cold, hard logic of verified data. Above all, it is found in the definitive, unflinching refusal to be a victim. I turned away from the shredder and walked out of the office. I returned to the front foyer, placing my hand flat against the cool, smooth brass of the heavy deadbolt. I checked the locking mechanism, ensuring the steel cylinder was firmly engaged in the heavy timber door frame. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, and carried the warm mug back into the sunroom. Leo looked up from his wooden blocks, offering a bright, unburdened smile. I sat down on the floor beside him, the morning sun warming my shoulders. The perimeter was secure. The threat was neutralized. Some doors are meant to stay closed forever.
We spend our lives building fortresses in the manicured suburbs of America, where the lawns are cut into perfect emerald grids and the driveways are paved with crushed stone. We lay down brick and slate to construct what we believe is security. We chase the definitive markers of success, the right zip code, the prestigious country club membership, the vehicles that signal to our neighbors that we have arrived. But somewhere in that relentless pursuit of the American dream, a perilous shift can occur behind closed doors. The very things meant to provide shelter can slowly transform into cages, and the family we are meant to protect can become the audience we are trying to impress. When we look closely at the collapse of families caught in the undertow of status and wealth, a sharp, unyielding truth emerges about the nature of human consequence. In communities where the external shell of material success and social dignity is prized above all else, it is terrifyingly easy to lose sight of genuine consciousness. It is a quiet tragedy how easily love becomes entangled with ownership. Many parents, blinded by the expectations of traditional success, fall into the trap of viewing their children not as independent souls entrusted to their care, but as extensions of their own ambitions. In this distorted reality, a child is reduced to a tool, a decorative ornament polished to enhance the family's portrait of prestige for the outside world. We tell ourselves we are pushing them for their own good, but too often we are merely polishing our own trophies. This clinging to illusions, the desperate grip on country club access luxury cars, and the envious stares of the community causes a slow erosion of the conscience. We begin to worship the veneer, and when that veneer is threatened by financial instability or public failure, the raw, unfiltered ego takes over. In those desperate moments of self-preservation, the darkest aspects of human nature are revealed. We witness parents willing to trample on their own flesh and blood, ready to sacrifice the well-being of their children just to maintain a fragile grip on a counterfeit glory. How do we break this cycle? How do we navigate a culture that constantly demands we perform our success? The answer does not lie in screaming matches or reactionary anger. True clarity never arrives in the middle of a storm of rage. Wisdom is born in stillness. It is the profound ability to sit quietly in the center of chaos, to observe without immediately reacting, and to separate one's own emotions from the psychological manipulation of others. When we apply logic, seek out the hard data of our reality, and rely on undeniable evidence, we develop a vision sharp enough to pierce through the thickest fog of deception. Truth ultimately is the only impenetrable shield. No matter how grand the estate or how heavy the designer fabric, a gilded exterior cannot conceal deceit indefinitely. Choosing to live in the truth, aligning our actions with reality, adhering to the law, and walking a path of moral integrity is the only foundation that can guarantee a tranquil mind. When you are anchored in the truth, you strip away the fear of being manipulated. You become untouchable. This brings us to the ultimate responsibility of parenting and family guidance. The law of cause and effect is always in motion, operating silently beneath the surface of our lives. True morality is not found in the eloquent speeches delivered at charity galas, nor is it measured by the size of the checks written to local endowments. Morality is measured exclusively by how we treat the most vulnerable people in our orbit. When a family resorts to fabrication, deceit, and the theft of what belongs to another, even if they attempt to justify these actions as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the family name, they are planting the seeds of their own destruction. The core duty of a parent is to shelter, uplift, and forgive. It is a commitment to unconditional love, not a transactional demand for blind obedience to feed a parent's insatiable greed. The greatest legacy we can leave to the next generation is not a sprawling real estate portfolio or an untouched trust fund. The only inheritance of real value is an upright character and an intact sense of self-respect. Standing firm against a toxic tide requires a staggering amount of inner strength, especially when the tide is generated by your own bloodline. There is a deep-seated cultural expectation that family loyalty must be absolute, that we must endure any level of mistreatment simply because we share a last name. But walking away from a poisonous dynamic is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound compassion. It is compassion for yourself, and crucially, it is compassion for the children you are raising. Setting an unbreakable boundary is the only way to sever the generational loop of trauma and ensure that the venom does not seep into the soil of the next generation. The pinnacle of this resilience is the ability to walk away without carrying the heavy baggage of hatred or guilt. When you establish absolute boundaries and step calmly out of the wreckage of the past, without the desire for retaliation, and without the agonizing ache of internal regret, you demonstrate the ultimate liberation. You prove that your soul is finally completely free. If these quiet battles and the search for authentic justice resonate with you, if you have ever had to build a fortress of truth to protect the ones you love, I invite you to subscribe to Orange Vengeance. We tell the stories of those who find their strength in the silence, who draw the hard lines, and who choose to break the cycles they inherited. The front door clicks shut, the deadbolt turns, and the house is finally secure. The noise of the outside world is locked away, leaving you alone in the warmth of the life you fought so fiercely to build. But as you stand in the quiet hallway looking through the glass at the empty driveway, a lingering question settles into the stillness. When the echoes of the past finally fade away and the ghosts of expectations are put to rest, What new sounds will fill the silence you sacrificed everything to protect?